Ethan Carter had always believed that silence was a kind of language, one that revealed truths people rarely dared to speak. The quiet, dense forest that surrounded the new research base felt like a continuation of that belief. It was peaceful, but it held secrets. When he and his partner Clara moved to the edge of the wildlife preserve, he thought it would be a fresh beginning, a chance to mend what routine and distance had quietly damaged between them. But beginnings, he was learning, had a way of testing what was already fragile. Clara noticed the shift before Ethan did. The way his attention drifted during breakfast, the way he stared out at the misty horizon longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to appear. She tried to fill the silence with conversation, stories about the house, the neighbors, the endless unpacking, but his responses came slower each day. He wasn't cold, just absent, like someone walking through FOGE.at the research facility. Ethan found himself absorbed in a new assignment, an environmental study focused on the migratory behavior of forest mammals. It was the kind of work that demanded patience and observation, both qualities he possessed in abundance. When the project coordinator introduced a new field assistant, a volunteer from an environmental NGO in Kenya, Ethan hardly looked up at first. But when Malik Kato entered the room, something about the man's calm presence caught his attention. Malik was unlike anyone Ethan had worked with before. He was confident but not loud, his movements deliberate, his smile easy yet restrained. There was a steadiness about him that seemed to quiet the noise around him. During the briefing, he listened more than he spoke, nodding thoughtfully as though every detail carried weight. When their eyes met briefly across the table, Ethan felt something unspoken pass between them, a faint recognition, not of familiarity, but of intrigue. Over the next week, their paths crossed often. Malik assisted with data collection, sometimes joining Ethan in the lab to review samples or note field results. Their conversations began formally, technical, precise, but gradually drifted into personal territory. Malik spoke of his homeland, of dry seasons and green valleys, of how nature taught him patience. Ethan, in turn, found himself sharing small details about his own life, his love for the rain, his unease with crowds, his habit of collecting old maps. Clara noticed that he returned home later each evening. When she asked if the workload was heavy, Ethan simply nodded, adding that Malik was efficient and that the team's progress depended on long hours. She smiled politely but watched his face as he spoke, sensing that something had changed beneath his calm surface. The first real sign came a week later, during a team meeting. The institute announced an upcoming field assessment, a 3-day survival and observation exercise deep inside the jungle. 2-person teams would venture out to test their endurance and record nocturnal animal activity. Ethan volunteered immediately, surprising even himself with how quickly he raised his hand. When the coordinator asked for his chosen partner, he said Malik's name without hesitation. Later that night, Clara asked why he hadn't picked one of his longtime colleagues. Ethan shrugged. Malik's reliable. He's good in the field, he said, though even to himself, the words felt rehearsed. She said nothing more, only reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Her touch was warm, familiar, yet something inside him stayed distant, unreachable. In the days leading up to the expedition, Ethan felt an unfamiliar restlessness. He told himself it was the anticipation of the fieldwork, the challenge of navigating wild terrain. But beneath that reasoning pulsed a quieter truth, curiosity. He wanted to understand Malik beyond the polite exchanges and professional boundaries. There was a depth to him, a quiet confidence that drew Ethan closer, not through words but through presence. The morning of departure arrived with a mist that hung low over the trees. Clara helped him pack, folding his clothes neatly, slipping a small note into the side pocket of his bag. "For when you can't sleep," she said with a faint smile. Ethan kissed her forehead, thanked her softly, and promised to call once they returned. She watched from the porch as he loaded his gear into the truck, her hand raised in a wave that lingered long after he disappeared down the dirt road. The drive to the jungle was long, winding through narrow paths and forgotten villages. Malik sat beside him, occasionally pointing out a tree species or the tracks of a wild animal in the dust. Their conversation was sparse but comfortable. There was a rhythm between them, built not from familiarity but from a shared understanding of solitude. By the time they reached the forest base, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They unloaded their supplies, checked their equipment, and set up camp by a small river clearing. The sound of flowing water mingled with the distant calls of unseen creatures. Malik gathered wood for the fire while Ethan assembled the tent, their movements wordless yet synchronized. As the flames rose, Malik sat across from Ethan, his face illuminated by the orange light. He began to speak about his childhood, the sound of drums on nights of celebration, the scent of rain on dry earth. His voice carried warmth, unhurried, almost melodic. Ethan listened, drawn in by the simple honesty of it. When Malik asked about his life, Ethan hesitated before answering. He spoke of his city, his studies, his relationship with Clara, but his words felt thin, as if describing someone else's existence. The night deepened, the forest alive with whispers. A silence stretched between them, neither heavy nor awkward, just present. Malik looked into the fire, then at Ethan. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we go far to find what we were afraid to see close to home." Ethan didn't reply. The words lingered in his mind long after Malik turned away. He thought of Clara, of their quiet dinners, their unspoken distance, and wondered what he was truly searching for in this place. The forest around them seemed to pulse with unseen life. Crickets hummed, the river murmured, and the fire crackled in small bursts. Ethan felt both alone and understood in a way he couldn't name. It wasn't attraction he felt, not yet, but recognition, as though Malik's presence mirrored something hidden within himself. When he finally lay down inside the tent, the night air cool against his skin, he could still hear Malik moving outside, humming a faint tune in his native tongue. The melody faded slowly, leaving Ethan awake with thoughts that refused to quiet. Tomorrow, they would begin their test, 3 days alone in the wilderness. But even now, Ethan sensed that what awaited them wasn't merely a test of survival. It would be something deeper, quieter, and far more revealing. That he closed his eyes, listening to the forest breathe. The silence, once familiar, now carried a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. After their initial meeting, Ethan couldn't seem to shake the thought of Ryan Hayes from his mind. The gray of his eyes, the gentle confidence in his tone, and the subtle warmth in his gestures replayed themselves over and over, each memory teasing a curious ache he didn't fully understand. It was strange, almost disorienting, to feel drawn to someone Lucas had chosen, but Ethan couldn't deny the magnetic pull. He told himself it was merely curiosity, a fascination born of novelty, yet he sensed it was something deeper, more complicated. Over the next few days, Lucas orchestrated several more encounters under the guise of casual outings. There was a brunch at a sunlit cafe, a walk along the riverside, even a shared visit to a small art exhibit. Each meeting seemed harmless on the surface, yet beneath it, the tension between Ethan and Ryan grew in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Ethan began noticing the way Ryan's attention lingered slightly longer than expected, the way he listened with genuine care, asking questions that reached beyond small talk. There was a rare sincerity in Ryan's curiosity about Ethan's thoughts, dreams, and fears, an authenticity Ethan hadn't often encountered. Lucas, of course, remained present in the background. Ethan was acutely aware of his brother's watchful eyes, of the faintly approving nods when Ryan smiled or laughed. Lucas had always been protective, and sometimes that protection felt stifling, but now Ethan noticed it as an invisible boundary, one he was starting to question. He wondered how much of his attraction to Ryan was shaped by Lucas' endorsement, and how much was his own uncharted desire. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city, Ethan felt the weight of that question. Ryan had leaned back slightly, hands folded loosely in his lap, speaking about his recent travels with a soft enthusiasm that drew Ethan in. There was a warmth in Ryan's voice that seemed to resonate directly with Ethan's chest. It wasn't physical, at least, not in the obvious sense, but it carried a subtle intimacy that made Ethan feel both exposed and comforted at the same time. "You always seem so calm, even when everything around you is chaotic," Ryan said quietly, his gray eyes locking with Ethan's. The observation was casual, but Ethan felt it pierce him like a careful arrow. He opened his mouth to respond, but words stumbled in his throat. "I guess I try," Ethan finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. He looked down at his hands, feeling a strange vulnerability he had rarely experienced. Ryan smiled, not mockingly, not teasingly, but as if he genuinely understood. That moment marked a subtle shift. Ethan realized that Ryan wasn't simply attractive or charismatic, he was attentive in a way that mattered. He noticed the little things, the nervous way Ethan fiddled with his coffee cup, the slight hesitation in his speech, the small, almost imperceptible movements of discomfort when topics brushed too close to personal pain. Each observation, each nuance, made Ethan feel seen in a manner he had longed for but rarely received. Lucas' presence, meanwhile, became both comforting and confining. He continued to offer subtle guidance, suggesting topics to discuss or places to go, always under the pretense of helping Ethan feel comfortable. But Ethan felt the tension between loyalty to his brother and his growing interest in Ryan. The conflict gnawed at him quietly, manifesting in restless nights and daydreams he couldn't quite control. It was during one of these curated outings that the dynamic shifted further. Ryan had suggested a quiet bookshop tucked in an older part of town, a place where the soft hum of classical music mingled with the scent of aged paper and polished wood. Lucas had insisted on joining at first but quickly became absorbed in browsing, leaving Ethan and Ryan alone in a secluded corner. The solitude allowed the conversation to deepen. They spoke about childhood memories, aspirations, and disappointments, the kind of confessions usually reserved for long-trusted friends. Ethan felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear. There was something dangerously compelling about Ryan's attentiveness, a pull that made Ethan's heart race despite his rational mind warning him to maintain distance. "You have a way of seeing people that's rare," Ethan admitted, voice barely above a whisper. He immediately regretted the words, but Ryan only tilted his head, his gray eyes thoughtful. "I think people want to be seen," Ryan said softly. "Most just don't get the chance to be." His response lingered in the air, unforced yet precise, as if he had intentionally chosen words to reach something deep inside Ethan. The encounter left Ethan both exhilarated and conflicted. As they exited the shop and walked through the quiet streets, he was aware of the subtle brush of Ryan's hand against his, the way their proximity seemed natural yet fraught with unsaid rules. Every glance, every pause, hinted at a connection that was emotional first, almost imperceptibly romantic, yet utterly intoxicating. That night, Ethan lay awake in his apartment, replaying every nuance of the day. He reflected on Lucas' subtle influence, the careful orchestration of meetings, and his own responses to Ryan's attentiveness. A part of him felt guilty. Loyalty to his brother clashed violently with curiosity about Ryan. And yet, he could not deny the growing intensity of his feelings. The tension was no longer simply external, it had burrowed into his own consciousness, demanding attention, stirring questions he had not prepared to answer. By the end of the week, the subtle emotional dance between Ethan and Ryan had reached an unspoken crescendo. Every encounter carried the faintest spark, each gesture layered with meaning, and every conversation opened doors to vulnerability that Ethan had rarely experienced. It was not overt, not forced, but quietly electric, a pull that both thrilled and terrified him. Ethan recognized, with a mixture of excitement and fear, that he was standing at the threshold of a choice. He could continue the careful, polite boundaries Lucas had established, or he could explore the undeniable connection that had formed between him and Ryan. The uncertainty was intoxicating, the potential consequences were real. Yet, in the quiet corners of his heart, Ethan realized that this story was no longer about Lucas' judgment or guidance, it was about his own desires, and for the first time, he felt compelled to confront them honestly. As he drifted to sleep that night, the city lights outside his window shimmering faintly like distant stars, Ethan sensed the inevitability of what was to come. Ryan had become more than a curiosity, more than a carefully suggested companion. He had become a presence that stirred emotions Ethan could no longer ignore. And deep within, Ethan knew that the next step, whatever it might be, would change the course of his life forever. The following weeks unfolded quietly, as if the apartment itself held its breath. What had once felt like polite distance between Lucas and me began to soften into something warmer, something unspoken but persistent. The morning silences at the coffee maker turned into conversations that lingered too long. He'd ask about my day before it even began, and I found myself wanting to answer that we developed a rhythm that felt natural, too natural. He cooked dinner most nights, and I cleaned up afterward. Sometimes he'd stay in the kitchen with me, leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, voice low and unhurried. He'd tell small stories about his past, a childhood in Oregon, a brother he hadn't spoken to in years, a dream of one day owning a small cafe by the coast. His stories carried a melancholy that mirrored my own. One night, as I dried the last plate, I asked without thinking, "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" He smiled faintly, eyes focused on the dark window. "You stop noticing after a while," he said. Then, after a pause, "until someone reminds you what company feels like." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. But something in his tone lingered, circling my thoughts long after I went to bed. Lucas had a way of filling the space between words with emotion. A brush of his hand, a glance across the room, each one carried more meaning than entire conversations. I told myself it was friendship, the kind of fragile connection two lonely people build to survive. But each day made the lie harder to maintain. It was late one evening when he mentioned Dylan. We were on the balcony, a bottle of red wine between us, the city lights flickering below. "I haven't been completely honest," he said, tracing the rim of his glass with a finger. The air grew still. "I'm still seeing someone. His name's Dylan. We've been together for years, but he travels a lot for work. Things have been complicated." I felt the ground shift under me. "Complicated how?" I asked, though part of me already knew that he sighed. "He's gone most of the time. When he's here, it feels like we're strangers sharing the same house. I guess I didn't realize how lonely I was until you moved in." I looked at him, heart thudding. His confession wasn't shocking, it only confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, but hearing it aloud made it real. It changed the way the air felt between us. "I'm not trying to make things messy," he added quickly, reading the hesitation on my face. "I just needed to tell you." The silence that followed was heavy and alive. I could hear the faint hum of traffic below, the whisper of wind against glass. I wanted to leave, to end the moment before it became something irreversible. But I stayed. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the closing of his door. My mind replayed his words again and again, each repetition threading guilt through the quiet longing I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I told myself to keep my distance. But distance is a fragile thing when you share walls and mornings. Days later, it was the heater that started it. My room's old radiator broke in the middle of an unusually cold night. I tried to fix it, but the metal hissed and rattled uselessly. Lucas knocked on my door, hair messy from sleep. "You'll freeze in here," he said. "Come stay in my room until it's fixed." I hesitated. "That's not necessary." "It's fine, Ethan," he said softly. "I'll take the couch if it makes you more comfortable." But when I stepped into his room, it was clear he hadn't meant it. The bed was wide enough for two, and the couch barely large enough for one. I told myself it was temporary, just one night that we lay there, a careful space between us, the glow from the streetlight cutting through the blinds. Neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and my own heart, too loud in the quiet. Then, faintly, he whispered, "Do you ever wish things were simpler?" I turned my head. He was looking at me, eyes open in the dark. "Sometimes," I said. "But simple doesn't always mean right." He smiled sadly. "No. It doesn't." The space between us dissolved. His hand found mine under the blanket, hesitant at first, then sure. I didn't pull away. The touch felt inevitable, like gravity, slow, certain, unstoppable. When his lips met mine, the world shrank to the quiet pulse of breath and heartbeat. It wasn't rushed, not desperate, just two people stepping across a line they'd been pretending not to see. For a moment, everything felt right in the wrong way. Later, I lay awake, watching the faint light spill across his face. He looked peaceful, younger somehow. But guilt crept in, cold and certain. I had promised myself I wouldn't become part of someone else's betrayal, yet here I was, tracing the same painful outline. At dawn, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The apartment was hushed, the kind of stillness that follows after something irreversible. I made coffee, hands trembling slightly, and stared out the window as the sky turned pale. When Lucas entered the kitchen, he didn't speak. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what we both already knew. His touch was warm, but it burned with consequence. That he finally said, "Dylan's coming back this weekend." I froze. The words landed heavy. "Does he know?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. And I don't know what to do." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The coffee steamed between us, untouched. "I shouldn't have," I began, but he cut me off gently. "Don't," he said. "Last night was real. Even if it was wrong." I wanted to believe him, but the truth pressed hard against my chest. Real didn't make it right. The rest of the day passed like a half-remembered dream. I went through the motions, work, chores, quiet meals, but the air between us had changed. Every look, every word carried the weight of something forbidden. That night, as Lucas slept beside me again, I stared at the ceiling. I could feel the warmth of him, close enough to touch, close enough to destroy. That I told myself I could stop it here, that this would be the last night, the last secret. But as his hand brushed mine in sleep, the lie settled heavy and familiar in my chest. That I turned toward him, watching the faint rhythm of his breath. He looked calm, content. I envied that peace. That I whispered to the dark. I told myself it was love. The words barely left my lips before the truth followed, silent but undeniable. That it already felt like a secret.